This evening, marking the beginning of our lecture series starting in the fall, I feel quite privileged to be able to be the first speaker for the season. And the topic that I have decided to speak on, quite naturally, is related to Buddhism, because that is the main area of knowledge that I have. And the topic for this evening's talk is enlightenment, not just for the Buddha. And maybe I should have put a question mark after that title, because it remains to be seen whether enlightenment is just for the Buddha or whether it is also for us. And so I'd like to explore this theme with you this evening. The presentation will be divided more or less into two parts. One is just talking about the Buddha and what his experience was, as has been passed down to us through the scriptures in the Pali text tradition. Pali is the language that is used by the Theravada school of Buddhism. It is very similar to Sanskrit, a kind of a slightly different version of it. But it is the language in which the scriptures of this school of Buddhism is preserved, and we call that the Pali Canon. Most of the references that I will be presenting to you this evening are taken from various texts within the Pali Canon. And often I will be using a few Pali terms, but not so much. And they are very similar to Sanskrit if you are more familiar with the Sanskrit terms. Now, to begin with, the Buddha, the word Buddha actually is not a name, as many of you will know. Buddha is more like a title, just like president is a title, not a name of a person. So Buddha, the word itself, means the enlightened one. And Siddhartha Gautama, who was the historical person whom we refer to as the Buddha, was not born a Buddha. He was born Siddhartha Gautama, a human being, who had a history and a life until he eventually renounced his princely life and went to seek some spiritual, I guess spiritual enlightenment was what he was seeking for. But he undertook a training of being an ascetic in India. This is about 500 BC. And it is said that after 6 years of this quite strenuous search and quest for enlightenment, he claimed to have achieved it. And he was quite open about it in talking about his experience. And these are some of the teachings that he spoke and which were recorded and which we find in the Pali Canon. So as you probably know, the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, he was an ascetic, and after 6 years of striving, he came to this wonderful, beautiful Bodhi tree and sat underneath it. And on the night of his enlightenment, he had these rather profound experiences. So, in the scriptures, one of the first things it says is that he's relating this experience on the full moon of May. And he says that when I had eaten solid food, because for quite some time he had practiced some extreme austerities that had left him very weak and frail and really in no fit state to do very much in terms of mental cultivation. So he'd gone back to what he called the middle way, partaking of sufficient nutriment to keep the body going, being healthy enough to undertake some mental training in meditation. So he's relating here that once he'd regained his strength and he felt quite healthy, this is when, he was eventually that night sitting under the Bodhi tree. And he practiced meditation. And he actually describes the meditation that he practiced as mindfulness of breathing. And through this practice, which he had by then become very proficient in and very skilled in, he was able to attain very deep states of meditation or concentration or stillness, silence, a very refined states of awareness. And this is what he describes. Then, quite secluded from sensual desires, secluded from unwholesome states, I entered upon and abode in the first jhana, the second jhana, the third jhana, and the fourth jhana. Now, this is, of course, rather difficult to understand unless you are familiar with the Buddhist terminology, the Buddhist teachings, and the Pali language. But it is these 4 jhanas or 4 states of refined meditation are what constitute Samma Samadhi, or right concentration, perfect Samadhi in the Eightfold Path. They are levels of refinement of the mind that are difficult to develop and require a lot of training and a very solid foundation in many other areas other than just sitting meditation. And we will be speaking about that later this evening. But let us to say that this is the quality of mind that he was able to arrive at through this meditation. And this is more or less the quality of mind that is required, that is the necessary condition for arriving at penetrating insight. This is a very important point. It will become maybe a little clearer. When his mind was thus concentrated, purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfections, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, I directed it to the knowledge of the destruction of the asavas. This word is very interesting too. But I just want to say again, it's when his mind had attained that degree of stillness, silence, tremendous clarity, penetrating mindfulness, was he able to direct it to have some penetrating revelations. So the mind was fit for this task, fit for the work of seeing clearly. And here he says he directed it to the knowledge of the destruction of the asavas. Here is translated as taints, which is a very weak word. Doesn't sound like it's anything. What's a taint? Asavas can be translated as corruptions, intoxicants, cankers, disease. That defilement is the most general word. That which binds one to the realm of samsara, that which keeps one spinning in the realms of samsara. This is the tendencies, deep-rooted tendencies of the mind associated with ignorance, attachment, greed, hatred, all the various forms that come from these basic intoxication, basic not knowing the truth that keeps us engaged in samsara. And just to put some context here, the reason why this is important, that the Buddha is saying this is what he's really wanting to know, the destruction of defilements. That was the ultimate goal of his spiritual life, of his spiritual training, the destruction of defilements, the elimination of the taints, of the intoxications, of the various forms of ignorance and delusion and craving and aversion. It wasn't to experience some psychic phenomena, some otherworldly fantastical experience. It was for the eradication of this basic ignorance. And the reason he had that as the aspiration was because just before he applied his mind in this way. In the scriptures, it does say that he had had already 2 very profound knowledges that arose in him. And one was the recollection of past lives. So he could recollect countless past lives, beginningless. There is no beginning that can be perceived to the realm of samsara. The other insight and knowledge that arose in him was the seeing with the divine eye how beings migrate or are reborn, their process of rebirth from one life to another life to another life according to their karma and the fruits of their karma. So he had this grand view of the nature of samsara and found it unsatisfactory. He found it depressing, if you wish, but he was not depressed. He just felt this disenchantment with it. And he wanted to know, what is the end? Is there an end to this? Repeated birth, rebirth, passing away, coming back from one life to another, refined, coarse, high, low, a never-ending cycle. Is there an end? What keeps this going? And so that's what he wanted to really get to. With this concentration as the basis, that clarity, there arose in him knowledge and vision of things as they really are. This is what the insight of the Buddha was. He, with that pure, concentrated mind, he directed it to the nature of samsara. And he had this very clear, direct insight and knowledge. And they use the 2 words to stress that it's something very immediate. And it's something that is not intellectual in any way. It's a direct seeing, a direct knowing, a reality that is beyond any question. The nature of samsara, the nature of existence. Samsara is existence. With penetrating insight, he saw clearly that existence is impermanent. It is unsatisfying, unsatisfactory, unable to be a refuge and provide security, stability, happiness, because it is continually changing. And it is not self. It is not mine. It is not yours. There is no one who owns it or can control it. It is empty. It is an empty process that rolls on, that keeps on going. And this realization that seeing the empty nature and the unsatisfactory nature of samsara is what led to his disenchantment, dispassion, and abandonment. And he expressed this in what it normally formula that is most commonly known and the most commonly spoken about is the realization of the Four Noble Truths. He realized this is suffering, this is the origin of suffering, this is the cessation of suffering, and this is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. So this is the insight that he had, and at that moment is when we call him Buddha, the enlightened one. Knowing thus, seeing thus, my heart was liberated from the taint of sensual desire, from the taint of being, and from the taint of ignorance. When liberated, there came the knowledge, it is liberated. And I had direct knowledge. Birth is exhausted. The holy life has been lived out. What was to be done is done. There is no more of this to come. Now, he was quite clear about his own realization, that it was complete. And he had this, what we call the lion's roar, a statement that was to be resounding through the various realms of existence. And a vision and insight arose in me thus: unshakable is the deliverance of my heart. This is the last birth. There is no more re-becoming or rebirth. So this was for the Buddha quite a transformative experience. This is when Siddhartha became Buddha. It was a remarkable, transformative experience that eradicated all the attachments, all the ignorance, all the fuel that would keep him spinning in the realm of samsara, because he knew samsara through and through for what it was, and there was no longer any infatuation for it. There was no longer any intoxication regarding it. He was fed up with it, and there was no longer anything to do. Now, what the experience was, it's a description of something that he experienced. We don't really quite know what that is. We understand the words, we can have concepts about it, but again, we don't know for ourselves. But it is important to at least recognize that it was something extraordinarily profound and that radically changed him, and that it completely eradicated, eliminated all the cankers, all the defilements, all the fetters, if you wish, all the things, the tendencies within the mind that binds us to samsara. And we talk about these as basically the three main defilements of greed, hatred, and delusion. But from them, there comes a whole array of other forms of defilements. But it was the complete uprooting, if you wish, of these defilements. Why? Because he saw samsara for what it was, existence for what it was, and there was no longer any delusion about it. The defilements come because of not seeing it for what it is. We are seeing something and taking it to be something worth attaching to. When he saw it according to reality, it was not worth attaching to. So there was no need to actually let go of anything. There was just no attachment to it. It was the culmination of his spiritual quest, and he said quite explicitly, nothing more to be done. So it's not like, oh, I'm enlightened, but I've still got to do these other practices. Nothing more to be done. Finished. And lastly, he definitely knew he was enlightened and said so. It wasn't like he was timid about it. Now, often in the scriptures, we also find that achieving enlightenment is referred to as attainment of nirvana in Sanskrit, nibbana in Pali. And nibbana or nirvana was defined by the Buddha as the destruction of lust, the destruction of hatred, the destruction of delusion. This is called nibbana. Lobha, dosa, moha are the three root defilements. In the texts and in the time of the Buddha, he used quite a variety of words for defilements. And we have in English as well a number of different words that we can use. But these are kind of the root defilements. Greed, hatred, delusion is what they usually term. And these were eradicated. When they say the word destruction, it's probably not a very good translation. Eradication, elimination, it's just they are abandoned. They are no longer there. That's uprooted, if you wish. They are no longer there. And they are not there. It's not that he decides to let them go. It's once there is this complete radical seeing into the true nature of existence, there is no longer the tendency to approach existence out of greed, hatred, and delusion. There is just, that's gone. And so this is, again, the end of greed, hatred, and delusion means the end of all negative mental and emotional states. Greed, hatred, and delusion are just like three terms from which springs a whole host of other negative mental emotions, states, worry, anxiety, jealousy, fear, resentment, irritation, impatience, and you go on and on and on. All the things that disturb and agitate the mind, including dullness, including just any little irritation in the mind that we experience is the result of some wrong view, some sort of defilement. So the enlightened mind, or the Buddha, or any other enlightened person, is at peace, is peace. The world and the worldly conditions no longer have power to disturb that peace. And this is a very nice quote from the scriptures. Just as a rock of one solid mass remains unshaken by the wind, even so neither visible forms, nor sounds, nor odors, nor tastes, nor bodily impressions, neither the desired nor the undesired, can cause such a one, an enlightened one, to waver. Steadfast is his mind, or her mind, gained is deliverance. So in Buddhism, they often talk about the worldly winds, the 8 worldly winds: gain and loss, fame and disrepute, health and sickness, birth and death, the polarity of life, the things that we all experience. An enlightened one experiences those things too. The difference is that they do not shake the mind. They have no power to disturb the mind, not unlike ordinary people. When we get praised, we're very happy. If we're blamed, we're feeling sad. When we gain something and make a lot of money, boy, are we happy. If things go wrong and we lose a lot of money, oh boy, are we sad. If we experience physical pain, we experience a lot of mental disturbance, maybe worry, maybe fear, maybe aversion. An enlightened person just experiences the condition as a worldly condition. It does not disturb the mind. No fear, no irritation, no aversion, no anxiety, no happy, sad, peace and free. Just like unshakable. So the Buddha was enlightened. And what I'd like to share with you next is, what could we expect from an enlightened person based on what some of the teachings in the Buddhist scriptures, some of the things that the Buddha said? Because there are many people who talk about either claiming to be enlightened. Not so many people claim to be enlightened, but there are some people who claim that, and then there are people who claim their teacher is enlightened, or there is a lot of, how do you know if somebody's enlightened? Well, to be honest, I don't think you can know for sure. You can know whether you're enlightened or not, and some people don't even know that, because some people say things like, well, you're enlightened, but you just don't know it. Well, I know I'm not enlightened, so that's all I can say. And that is, I base that on the teachings and the guidelines that the Buddha expressed, speaking from someone who claimed to be enlightened, seemed to be enlightened, and also someone who inspired a whole tradition of spiritual seekers that is still alive today, and which has produced many great masters and many great enlightened teachers over the centuries. And I was fortunate enough to meet some of these wonderful teachers who greatly inspired me, and I could see these qualities in them. I did not see things that, if I saw things that were not compatible with some of these attributes, I would question their enlightenment. And so I just wanted to share with you a couple of things for you to use as guidelines if talking about what would you expect? What sort of spiritual qualities would you expect of someone who's attained to this level of realization and liberation and freedom from defilements? One of the things the Buddha said, that just by nature, an enlightened person cannot store up possessions. Now that doesn't sound like much, but hoard and be preoccupied with getting and holding on to more and more for oneself. That is just contrary to the basic quality of non-attachment and relinquishment and no greed. So anyone who manifests this, being really kind of preoccupied with acquiring and getting more, I would say it's pretty sure he's not enlightened or she's not enlightened. The other thing is intentionally, by nature, they cannot intentionally kill any form of life. So I would not expect that an enlightened person would intentionally kill any living creature. That would be contrary to just the nature. They would also be, this is interesting for many people, unable to perform sexual or to have sexual intercourse, and that is because there is no greed or lust. Ajahn Brahm is a very humorous Buddhist monk who's spoken here at the Theosophical Society, and there are many of his talks on YouTube, some of them on the Theosophical Society YouTube channel. He's the abbot of a monastery in Perth, a good friend of mine, and he makes the comment that an enlightened person is potently, I've forgotten how he put it, potently impotent. That's right. An enlightened person is potently impotent. Once all craving or lust is abandoned, there is, you just don't expect that an fully enlightened person would have that propensity for sensual indulgence, let alone sexual indulgence. They are unable to tell a deliberate lie. It's just contrary to everything about them. And they are always, their way of relating to the world is never out of desire, ill will, or delusion, or out of fear. These are the qualities that they do not have. Greed, aversion, delusion, fear. They don't have those, they don't exist in the mind. The way they relate never comes from those qualities. So when somebody manifests actions or relates in a way that is, obviously coming from one of these qualities, I would be very suspect of them as to their spiritual attainment. What would the Buddha do? Well, how would he behave? Well, there are some positive. How would an enlightened person relate to the world, to life? How would they still continue to live? What would you expect? It's difficult. They still have personality, they still have tendencies, but because of this radical transformation in which the defilements were eliminated, everything that emanates from them comes from what we call the Brahma Viharas. These are the expressions that are natural to the enlightened person. This is what projects from them. It comes from loving kindness towards all beings. It comes from compassion for all who suffer, joy with the happiness of others, equanimity or unshakable peace under all circumstances. So these are the, what would be expected of an enlightened person is that they would be a great blessing to the world. They would be absolutely wonderful guests to have in your home or at the Theosophical Society. We would love to have more of them. So, now that's the Buddha, or that's an enlightened person. And it's just like, okay, either we believe it, that the Buddha was enlightened, or maybe we don't believe it, or basically we don't really know for ourselves. But where are we? And so I'd like to pose this question, because the beginning of the talk was enlightenment, not just for the Buddha. Okay, well, what about us? Am I enlightened? As I said earlier, I am quite confident that I am not enlightened. And I say that based on some self-observations with honesty. If enlightenment, full enlightenment, means the complete eradication of greed, hatred, delusion, of anxiety, worry, of the sense of fear and trepidation regarding any uncertainty, I can't claim to have that. I still recognize those tendencies within myself. Why? Well, because I haven't had the experience that the Buddha had. And the question is, why haven't we had that experience? If the truth is, samsara is still samsara. The truth is, the Buddha said, whether a Buddha arises or does not arise, whether someone knows it or doesn't know it, the truth is. And it doesn't belong to anyone. It's just the truth of the way things are. Samsara is still samsara, as it was in the time of the Buddha. It is so today. Existence is still existence in terms of variations, but its basic core nature is the same. Why are we still so attached? Why do we still have these biases, preferences, likes and dislikes, greed and aversion? Why are we not perfectly at peace this moment? Because we have not had this realization. Enlightenment means having knowledge and vision of things as they are, not as they appear. This refers to direct, penetrating insight into the three characteristics of existence: impermanence, suffering, and not self. Anicca, dukkha, anatta. Put briefly, it's having a penetrating insight, seeing clearly the true nature of existence, rather than the way we see existence. And there is a vast difference. If the way I see life and experience and existence leads me to have this inclination to want some part of it, reject some other part of it, think of it as belonging to me, being afraid of losing what I have, wanting to get something that I don't have, if I'm in this continuous state of chasing and fighting, I don't think I'm seeing things as they are, because the Buddha said, this is all empty. It is not worth attaching to. This is not where happiness can be found. And yet, we persist in continuing this futile, if you wish, quest for happiness from existence. And that is why we continue in samsara. That is why we are born, because we want to experience. We want to be able to see, to hear, to touch, to possess, in the hope of fulfillment. So, obviously, the way the Buddha sees existence and the way I see existence are different. And that's the difference between enlightened and unenlightened. Now, why don't I see things the way the Buddha sees them? Ignorance clouds our view of reality, and thus we remain fettered by craving and attachment. This is the fuel that keeps us in the cycles of samsara, longing for happiness. I stress the word longing because it is always longing, never achieving. Not to say there is no happiness in samsara or in existence. There is pleasure and pain. There is forms of happiness, but never permanent happiness. It comes and it's transient and it changes and you lose it and it comes again maybe and you lose it. And because of its nature, there is always this sense of turmoil, fear, anxiety, dissatisfaction, dissatisfied, unfulfilled. And so it is always that longing to be fulfilled from that which cannot fulfill us. Samsara cannot, it just cannot. It doesn't matter what you achieve, what you get, what you have, where you go, it will not be fulfilling in the end because it will be transient. So the Buddha, this ignorance regarding not seeing things according to reality, not seeing the true nature of existence, he called ignorance. Not no knowledge, it's just not seeing and knowing things according to reality, as they really are. That's delusion or ignorance. It exists and continues. We continue in that state because of the five hindrances. And the Buddha called these, there are, monks, these five hindrances which cause blindness, lack of vision, and non-knowledge, which prevent insight, are associated with pain and do not lead to Nirvana. These five hindrances are tendencies of the mind that we have that blind us, that keep us from seeing reality. They weaken our capacity to see reality. You remember at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that before his enlightenment, the Buddha talked about his state of concentration, and I labeled that slide, the mind fit for insight. Well, as long as the mind is under the influence of these five hindrances, it's just not fit for the work. It can't do the work. It can't penetrate because it's blinded by these hindrances. These in the scriptures, it talks about the five hindrances. Sense desire, preoccupation with sensuality or sensory pleasure, or sensory experience, the sensory world. Preoccupation with experiencing more and more of the sensory world, especially in the hope of experiencing pleasurable things. Ill will, that not wanting or that aversion towards things that we don't like, wanting to push things away, get rid of. So this is chasing and fighting. We're preoccupied with chasing and fighting. Sloth and torpor, dull mind, the mind that is low energy, it's dull. And the restless mind, here I've used the translation restlessness and worry, for this Pali term, uttacca kukucca. It's actually restlessness and remorse is more the correct translation. Restlessness, the mind that's just jumping around, hyperactive, distracted, chasing one thing after another thing, then ruminating about the past, quite often with remorse, because we did things that we're not proud of. The last of the 5 hindrances is just the skeptical doubt, the mind that cannot commit to something and see it through. It's always thinking that maybe there's a better way, something different, not really knowing much of any thing for sure. And we're not prepared to take any guidance, and we're not prepared to apply ourselves to find out if something is worthwhile and something works or something doesn't work. We just flip-flop from one thing to another without any real commitment. These 5 hindrances are what maintains ignorance, support ignorance, prevent seeing things as they really are. These are the things that the mind is hindered by. They're called hindrances. The veils that prevent us from having that experience. And this is a good time for us to reflect. How much of our energy do we spend on chasing after sensory pleasure? I mean, why am I not enlightened? Well, how much of my time do I spend watching TV, reading fiction, going to the movies, eating lots of food, drinking, partying? Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to expect to become enlightened if that's where you spend most of your time. How much of your time do we spend sleeping and just daydreaming? How much of our time do we, this restlessness, just flipping around, continuous chatter, whether it's from the news, the media, Facebook, whatever. The mind is just so distracted. We're being a little bit unrealistic if we're thinking that, yeah, I can do all of this and still expect to be enlightened. And so, in actual fact, this was one of the thoughts that occurred to the Buddha shortly after his own enlightenment as to whether he should teach or not. And his first thought was, well, it's kind of pointless going out there teaching. People are so preoccupied with, so just engaged in just seeking for sensual pleasures and worldly engagements and worldly preoccupations. People are they're not going to be able to realize this. This goes against the grain. It goes against the flow. It goes against the stream. But then he had a second thought. But there are some people with little dust in their eyes who are open to a spiritual aspiration and have spiritual aspiration and are willing to undertake a spiritual training. And so he did go and teach. And what he taught was the process, the training by which a human being, an ordinary person, can progress on the path that will result in this penetrating realization. And he called this the Noble Eightfold Path. So the Buddha did say that Nibbana, or Nirvana, is to be experienced individually by the wise. It's to be experienced and to be realized, each for oneself, really. The Buddha at most points the way. An enlightened person at most can be a good friend and point out, give instructions, guidance, help. But each person must walk the path. No one can do it for you. This is from the Buddhist perspective or the Buddhist teachings. So it is not a matter of somebody, at most the Buddha can encourage, can guide, can inspire. And that's the beauty of having living masters, that they inspire us and they guide us and they make the path better known to us by both word and example, so that we can follow that path by training. So in Buddhism, they often talk about the Threefold Training. And these are contained within the Eightfold Path. It's a training that one undertakes. And every aspect of this training has as its purpose, as its goal, that ability to have the experience of seeing and knowing things as they really are, insight. So the training usually begins with morality, virtue. And this, in Buddhist terminology, in the Eightfold Path, it really composes developing right speech, right action, right livelihood. And one may think, well, why do we have to start with that? Well, if you remember the hindrances, one of the very strong hindrances that a lot of people will experience very soon, that prevents us from experiencing any progress in meditation, is remorse, guilt, fear. And unless you have a foundation of virtuous living, it's very difficult to be free of guilt and remorse and fear. These virtues are not impotent. These virtues give us power, and they empower the mind. They make the mind more confident and able to progress in meditation. The next training is in concentration or meditation, and this usually involves right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. And the last one is training in wisdom, which is right view and right intention. These are just a grouping of training, aspects of the training that one undertakes in order to make progress on the path. In Buddhist countries, actually, they often talk about three trainings of a slightly different form. In Thailand, where I lived for many years, most times we spoke about dana, sila, bhavana. Dana is generosity, sila is virtue, and bhavana is mental cultivation. And I really like that, actually, a lot. And it's interesting how that is not stressed in the West very much. And I see a great difference between countries or cultures where that has been stressed, such as Thailand and many other Buddhist countries. People just have such a generous heart. They share very easily. And why is that important for the spiritual path? Well, it's self-evident. If it is to counteract greed and selfishness, generosity is a very powerful quality. So cultivating that, and of course, virtue, again, meditation is the mental cultivation. And so these are the 8 factors that the Buddha, when he taught the Eightfold Path of training, how one gets from here to there, often called it the raft. How we get across the stream of samsara. It's undertaking this training of bringing about the conditions within us that allow us to have insight. With a good foundation in living a virtuous life, having established ourselves in the commitment to spiritual training, I think it is good, definitely, very good to undertake a training in meditation. And this is something that it gets both to the heart of the practice, but also it depends so much on the preliminary work. The reason many people have difficulty with meditation is because of the lack of the foundation in all that is skillful and wholesome, be it generosity and virtue and all the right living and right livelihood. Living a life that is based on simplicity and renunciation, making a commitment to devote time and energy to the spiritual quest, to spiritual study, to spiritual practice, putting aside time to actually meditate is one of the primary requirements. So, Buddhist meditation is a systematic training of the mind. It's very systematic, very simple, but requires a tremendous amount of practice for most people. But the intention is to temporarily free the mind from the power of the hindrances, those 5 qualities that prevent the mind from seeing clearly. And we do that by making an effort, cultivating mindfulness, until we can refine the mind and approach degrees of stillness and silence, deep meditation, where there is bliss and joy, and the mind is freed temporarily from the defilements. They no longer obscure. It can take a long time, but it can be done. When the mind is thus purified from the hindrances, then it is fit for the task of penetrating the veil of delusion and having a direct insight into the true nature of existence. So, while the Eightfold Path outlines the training, the Buddha also spoke about, okay, if you follow this path diligently, the path in harmony results in these 2 things. And it is often called the Tenfold, the 2 extra steps. But it's really contained within the Eightfold Path and the right view. It's the arising of this, seeing it for what it is, so there's no longer any ignorance. So it's perfect view. But to make it more explicit, the Buddha on this occasion said that if the Eightfold Path is followed and it is complete, and the mind is able to temporarily be free of the hindrances, there can be right insight, knowledge and vision of things as they really are. We actually have the experience that the Buddha and every other enlightened person had in regards to seeing existence for what it is, as impermanent, unsatisfactory, not self. That experience, those words mean very little, but that experience, that seeing, radically transforms. Right liberation, the end of greed, hatred, and delusion, the end of all attachment. The seeing of things for what they are dispels the delusion, awakens us from the dream, frees us from the bonds, and the result of that is what we call enlightenment. So, why are we not enlightened? I shouldn't say we. Why am I not enlightened? Well, maybe still work to be done. The path is there. How much of that training are we willing to undertake? How much effort and time are we willing to put into it? And that is for each and every one of us to decide. What is our comfort zone? The lazy man will take a long time and a long path, a long way around. The more diligent and more committed practitioner maybe will arrive there a little faster. However, it is difficult to know because each of us have a history, and we don't know all of our history. With regards to the practice of meditation, I always say there are only two things that influence the result of how fast or slow one moves. And so we could make this into a more general, is how quickly or slowly will we progress towards enlightenment? I would say there are only two things. One is what you bring to it, and two, what you put into it. What we bring into it is our history. Our karmic history is long. Our current situation is what it is. What we put into it is the effort that we are willing to make going forward in terms of study, in terms of applying ourselves, in terms of training. And this is something that we are responsible for individually. At most, we can help each other by sharing and encouraging. I hope that this presentation this evening has done something along those lines. As I said, it is a sharing of a perspective from the Theravada Buddhist tradition as I understand it, and as I have studied and practiced over many years. And I am grateful that you've spent the evening with me exploring this topic.